Does something ever well up inside of you and begin to overflow? Take laughter, for instance. You hear something funny, and it can actually happen at an inopportune moment. Something tickles you. This happens to me all the time. Something strikes me as funny, and there's a little giggle that builds, and I try to stuff it down, but pretty soon it's really just a big guffaw that's coming out of me. Laughter overflows. Tears can overflow as well. Sometimes it's because we're grieving or sad, but sometimes it's because we're moved by transcendence, by magnificence, by goodness, by beauty. That'll happen in worship. It happens to me in worship frequently. And you feel first something building on the insides of your eyes, and then pretty soon tears are just running down your face, and sometimes it's difficult to explain why. Laughter and tears overflowed in life with Donna Martin when her mother died in 1996. Donna Martin's mother was mom to 18 biological children. That is a lot of children. But in addition to that, she was kind of an informal mom to most of the people of Possum Trot. Possum Trot is a town in East Texas that doesn't actually have paved roads or a stoplight of any kind. But when Donna Martin's mom died, it left her grieving and asking questions about her purpose in life. And as she thought about her mother and about her mother's goodness and the way she was a mom to so many people, Donna Martin began to hear Jesus telling her about a deeper purpose for her own life going forward. God was calling her to foster children and to adopt. And so she ran the idea by her husband, Bishop W.C. Martin, who was pastor of Bennett Chapel there in Possum Trot. And eventually he came on board. Life was beginning to overflow out of tears and laughter. Paul had the opportunity to watch as generosity overflowed in Macedonia. Paul had been the founder of those congregations in Macedonia. They had a special relationship, and he went to them with a need, a profound need. But the need hit them at a time when they themselves were experiencing great difficulty. Instead of walking away from the challenge, they stepped up to the challenge. They decided to do something to meet that profound need. Grace had flowed into their lives. Joy was welling up inside of them. And so generosity flowed out of them. And Paul wanted that for the church in Corinth, and I want that for us. That's what Paul is talking about here in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. He's describing the fact that something profound had happened to the church in Macedonia. And he said to the church in Corinth, I long for that same thing to happen for you. I long to see God's grace that has happened inside of you keep flowing. I long to see joy welling up, and I long to see joy and generosity flowing out of you. But what does that look like? And how does that happen? Because that's the very same thing that I long to see happen for us. As we look at the scripture today, we're discovering that generosity is meant to overflow. But the question hangs in the air in the verses we read today. Will it? Will it? Paul is addressing a need of the church in Jerusalem that had become actually quite profound. The church in Jerusalem was, of course, the first church, but taxes from the Romans in Jerusalem were incredibly high. On top of that, Jerusalem was a city that people moved to when they basically retired, and so Jerusalem was filled with widows, and the church in Jerusalem had taken many of those widows in. They had become disciples of Jesus, and the church had taken responsibility for caring for them. On top of that, the church in Jerusalem was sending numerous missionaries out to share the gospel. There was persecution in Jerusalem. Because they were followers of Jesus, they were persecuted, which meant that they lost job opportunities. They lost wealth. They became impoverished. And then in the late 40s AD, there was a famine in Jerusalem on top of it all. And so when Paul came to the leaders of the church in Jerusalem to get authorization for his ministry among the Gentiles, among the non-Jewish people of the Roman Empire, they eagerly said yes, but there was one request they made of them, and Paul writes about it in Galatians chapter 2, verse 10. He writes, "Only they asked us to remember the poor," the very thing I was eager to do. So Paul did that. He went to the Gentile churches that he had planted, and he asked them to give an offering to support the poor saints in Jerusalem. And churches that he had planted accepted the challenge. Paul, when he started the church in Corinth, put the same challenge in front of them, and they accepted that challenge. And so he wrote to them in 1 Corinthians, giving them details about how it was to happen. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 2, he writes, "On the first day of the week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come." Church in Corinth eagerly adopted this offering for themselves. But then they dropped the ball. New apostles came after Paul left. And these new apostles, when they taught, caused the church in Corinth to question Paul, to question his apostleship, his authority. This caused a breach in their relationship. It led to what Paul talks about as a painful visit and a painful letter. And as we come to 2 Corinthians, it happened between 1 and 2 Corinthians, as we come to the book of 2 Corinthians, Paul is still repairing that relationship with the church in Corinth. In between, the offering had been forgotten. And it's quite possible that the funds that had already been collected were used for another end. But the churches of Macedonia stepped up. Macedonia was to the north of Corinth, and the churches of Macedonia included churches in Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea. Paul had started those churches on his second missionary journey. You can read their stories in Acts chapters 16 and 17. But after starting those churches, they experienced deep persecution themselves. It led to the same kind of poverty in Macedonia that people were experiencing in Jerusalem. And so when Paul went to them with this need, he anticipated that, of course, they wouldn't give to it. And yet they insisted. They insisted on giving. They said, God has changed our lives, and we are so joyful, we cannot help but give to this thing that God is doing. And so they did. They gave generously, above Paul's expectations of any kind. And now the question is there. Will the church in Corinth rejoin the effort? And that's what Paul is writing to them in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. He's saying, look at what God has done in Macedonia. And he says, hey, you know what? They looked to you. It was your example in starting all of this that led Macedonian churches to do this. And he's even beginning to play on some rivalry between these two regions historically. Macedonia has given generously despite their poverty. And the question lingers in the air. Now, Corinth, what are you guys going to do? And so far, that question is unanswered. Paul is saying, generosity, guys, it's meant to overflow. But will it? The question hangs in the air. The generosity is meant to flow and overflow. And we see this in the life of Diane Sparks, who was the first person in Possum Trot to adopt a child. Donna Martin, when she began thinking about fostering and adopting, realized that she didn't know what she was talking about, didn't know what to do. So she reached out for help. She found a seminar that she could go to, a 13-week course, and she took her sister, Diane Sparks, to this course. And sitting there, she heard the most shocking statistic. There were 21,000 children in Texas at that point who were the victims of neglect and abuse by families and were waiting for some family to take them in, to foster them, and to adopt them. But Diane Sparks, her sister, as she heard that statistic, kept thinking about herself. I'm a single mom. And she looked at her surroundings. She had a mobile home with 2 small bedrooms in it. And she asked, what can a single mom with 2 tiny bedrooms do about this? But then she was the first one to leave. She adopted the first child. After she adopted one child, Donna and her husband, Bishop Martin, adopted 2 children. And then the sisters together adopted 2 more children. And something is really beginning. Generosity is beginning to flow. Grace is flowing. Generosity is beginning to overflow. And it's going to have surprising and wonderful benefits. And that leads us to what I would say is almost a mathematic-like equation that we see in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. It's an expression really with grace, joy and generosity overflow. I want you to think about that. With grace, joy and generosity overflow. And that's what we're seeing in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. There are 3 principles, though, that I want to draw out specifically from the text that help us to understand what that means. The first principle is God's grace gets joy and generosity flowing. God's grace gets joy and generosity flowing. And that's what we see happening in Macedonia. We see, first of all, the presence of God's grace in their lives. And it is God's grace that is the defining starting point for the spiritual life. And Paul writes about this in verse 1 of chapter 8, where he says, we want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. Grace is the beginning point of joy and generosity. This is not some kind of new legalism. It's not some kind of works righteousness. Everything in generosity begins instead with grace. It's not like we approach generosity and we think, well, there is a rule. And if you don't follow that rule, if you don't cross that line, you're somehow going to what? Lose your salvation or get stink eye from heaven over it? It's not a rule-based lifestyle. Instead, what happens is grace comes flowing into our lives, and as grace flows into our lives, good and wonderful things begin to flow out of our lives. Grace is always the beginning point. The second principle is that the hardest times are when joy and generosity surprisingly bubble up. And these were difficult times in Macedonia. The churches there were genuinely impoverished, and yet we read that it is in the midst of their poverty that God did something amazing. Verse 2, for in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. This is the kind of thing that, when you start to think about it, you can really argue with this. You can really say, well, wait a minute, this doesn't actually make any sense. You're saying that in their extreme poverty, that was the time when they engaged in some of their most radical generosity. In their extreme poverty, that was a time of great joy. But look at what's going on here. Joy is coming into their lives because of grace. Joy is not happiness. Joy is a gift of God. And out of joy comes this great generosity. And we say about that's the kind of thing that's very counterintuitive for us, because when we go through the tough times in life, when we face bills that we're not expecting, when we face things that obligations we can't meet, our first impulse is to pull back, and say that cannot be done. But what we find here instead is that the churches in Macedonia, when they were facing a difficult time, found that is the very time when joy begins to overflow, and that is the very time to be generous. And that is the very time when God does amazing things. Can you see that that is exactly what is happening in Possum Trot? These are people of limited means. And they are meeting a need, and they are seeing joy rise up and generosity flow as a result. Because these hard times are the times when joy and generosity surprisingly bubble up. And that leads us to a third principle, is that doing more than we think we can do is possible with God. Doing more than we think we can do is possible with God. Paul had low expectations of the churches in Macedonia. He was ready to let them off the hook, but if they were going to give something, he expected it to be very little. But instead, they came to him, they insisted on giving, and they gave far more than he ever anticipated. Verses 3 and 4 read, "For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means, of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints." Is that not amazing? Is that not amazing that in the midst of their need, they begged for the opportunity to give? And the interesting thing is that for us, when we get afraid, we tend to pull back. We look and we say, hey, if I do something more, it's going to endanger my happiness right now. We look and we think, if I do something more, it's going to endanger my future. And I suppose if you look at things from a worldly point of view, there may be some truth in that. But that's not how God's economics work at all. When we give, when we're generous, God's grace comes flowing into our lives. Joy rises up in our lives. God tends to meet every need that we have, and it's God who is at work. God is the one who is doing something amazing when we give. And so there may actually be, in the midst of this, a next step in generosity that God is calling each one of us to take today. Generosity is one of those things in the spiritual life that frequently functions like a journey. And journeys are things that we take one step in and then another and another and another. And so what is the next step of generosity that God is calling us to take today? It could be to get started in generosity by giving something like the churches of Macedonia did. As Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, though, he was telling them, on the first day of the week, lay aside something. And when I come, we'll collect it together. He's telling them to give with a plan. Maybe your next step is to give with some type of a plan. I remember when I was a child, I grew up in a tradition that taught that we were to tithe 10% of our annual income. And that is a beautiful tradition. And that is a great benchmark in giving. And yet at the same time, as I read what Jesus says about tithing and about generosity, I recognize that he is talking about something so much more than that, which is just a reminder, isn't it? That we're never done with a journey of generosity in our lives. Generosity is not about reaching a point where we say, well, I've done what I'm supposed to do and what I'm required to do. Generosity instead is a journey where we continue asking the question, what more can I do for God's glory? Because it is God's glory that we seek. Generosity is a lifelong journey that we grow in. Generosity, it's meant to overflow. And generosity did overflow among the people of Bennett Chapel with absolutely beautiful results. Bishop Martin got in front of the congregation and he talked to them about the Father heart of God and how God has adopted each one of us as sons and daughters of God. And he called the people of the church to do the same thing, to respond to the need around them and to foster and adopt children who needed homes. And they did. Over a couple of years, more than 20 families took in around 77 to 82 kids. And in taking those kids in, they fundamentally changed the landscape. And people heard about what was happening. And when they heard the story of what was happening, people came with resources to help. One group heard about what the people of Possum Trot had done, and they knew that the people of that town were already struggling before they took these 80-so kids in. And so they built a community center that could be used to help these children and to distribute aid to help the families of this town take in and support those children. Generosity didn't just flow, it's overflowing, and what God was doing there was miraculous. And the grace of God has been given among us, too. And what does the grace of God that's been given among us look like? That thing that starts generosity? Well, we have been forgiven of a debt that we could never repay. Jesus doesn't put the debt that we owe to God in financial terms in the New Testament. But if he did, we would look at a bill because of our sin and our rebellion against God that is so large we could never possibly repay that bill. But instead of saying, here is the bill and it is due, Jesus took that bill that belonged to us and he paid that bill on the cross. Now our debt is paid. Our obligation to God has been erased. We've been forgiven of our sin. Our debt is wiped away. That's grace. That's a gift from God. And we have been blessed. When we look at the poverty of the people in Macedonia and Jerusalem, we will never in our lives know that kind of poverty. We live in a land of prosperity. We have been surrounded by good things. We're given security. We are surrounded by beauty. That is not a guarantee that life is always going to be prosperous for us, but we have indeed been blessed mightily. And we too have been adopted. That's the thing that had happened to each person reading this letter and that this letter was written about. The people of Macedonia, of Jerusalem, of Corinth had been adopted as sons and daughters of God. And Paul said, as you have been adopted, you've been given grace, and grace is where generosity begins to overflow. Grace has been given to you. Will generosity overflow as a result? And just as a spoiler alert, the church in Corinth does eventually say yes and give generously to this offering for the saints in Jerusalem. And that's what's going on in Possum Trot. Those children who had no parent have been adopted as sons and daughters of God. Wow. Wow, that is amazing, isn't it? So the question is, grace that is meant to flow and overflow, generosity that's meant to overflow, is it going to overflow? You see, grace comes into our lives. It keeps flowing. It keeps building unless we say no to it. Joy wells up inside of us, and it keeps growing unless we stop it. And generosity, when it begins flowing, overflows naturally. It's just one of the fundamental rhythms of the spiritual life. As grace flows in and joy rises up, generosity comes out unless we say no to God. We stop the flow. But it's grace that we so desperately need to flow, and it's generosity that so desperately needs to flow out of us. Grace changed everything for the people in Possum Trot. When reporters came to Possum Trot to report on what they started calling the miracle of Possum Trot, they saw beautiful things. They'd go to church and they'd see families with 1, 2, 3 new kids sitting with them. And they'd see those kids singing. I'd see them sometimes playing instruments, participating in church leadership. They heard stories about the kids going to school and about kids dreaming about the future. And these are the stories that they wrote about in their publications. And that's one side of fostering and adopting. But there's another side to it as well, the more private side, what goes on behind the scenes. When Donna and Bishop Martin adopted their first 2 children, the older of the 2 had lived in a home where her biological mom had taught her to steal. Mom would send her to steal the food that they needed to eat as a family. It had been going on for years. So when the Martins adopted her, You have to understand, you don't forget behavior like that overnight. So she kept stealing from them, from public places. It took a long time for that behavior to go away. And that's just one example of the difficulty of fostering and adopting those children. There were nights of tears, nights of heartache, nights of praying and asking God, have I done the right thing? And asking God, will you help me do this thing that you've asked me to do? And it's grace that made the defining difference in those difficult nights. Grace flowed into their lives when they asked for it. And joy continued welling up, because joy is not happiness. Joy is a gift from God. Grace flowed in. Joy welled up in their lives. And generosity continued to flow and overflow as they kept loving and parenting those children together. Grace made that defining difference. When grace comes into our lives, generosity is the natural result. You see, when we give ourselves to God, we overflow with generosity. What happened in Possum Trot became eventually a book, a movie, and even a movement. Back in the 90s, when stories circulated about what had happened in Possum Trot, people were inspired. It touched people's lives. They helped not only with what was going on in Possum Trot, but they responded with awareness about foster parenting and adopting and how important it is. About 10 years later, Bishop Martin wrote a book to talk about the town's experience, about his experience. And the publication of that book caused it to happen all over again. It raised awareness all over again, and people understood what needed to be done. In 2024, it became a movie, The Sound of Hope. And I'll tell you this, The Sound of Hope tells a story of what really happened. And so if you choose to watch it, be prepared to be as disturbed as you are comforted and challenged by the movie. But the coming out of that movie once again raised awareness of the need for people to take in foster children and to adopt. And that awareness launches a movement. And that's the point. Grace flows in. We surrender ourselves to God, and generosity flows out. And that's the invitation that we're being given to generosity. We're being invited, yes, to let grace flow into our lives, to accept that grace flowing into our lives. We're being invited to let joy well up in our lives. Yes, we're being invited to that. And we are invited to let generosity flow out of our lives. And as soon as I say that, I need to tell you, that means that I am telling you that this is about something I want for you, not something I want from you. Please take careful note of that, because I know that as soon as I said the word generosity at the beginning of this sermon, half of you were like, click, brain off. I am not paying attention because Rob is trying to raise the budget. It is not about raising any budget. I have the joy of standing before you when we are in pretty good financial situation right now to talk about generosity. Generosity is not a tool for raising church budgets. Generosity instead is a fundamental spiritual discipline, a fundamental part of our relationship with God for each and every one of us. It's an invitation from God. And accepting that invitation has changed my own life. I remember as a teenager when I got my first paycheck. True story. I was excited to cash that paycheck so I would have money in hand that weekend to put in the offering plate at church, because I knew that I was participating in something good and something bigger than myself. And as a young adult, when Tammy and I were going through those years where you're struggling to make ends meet and every bill seems gigantic, trust me, I was the one writing the checks for the offering in those days. And when I'd write those checks, I would think about what else that money could go to do, what else we needed that money to do. But giving it was still a joy, because giving it meant we got to see what more God would do in the world and what God would do to take care of us. We never went without. And now we've reached the point in life where generosity is something that we get to grow in and constantly ask the question, what more can God do through us? Because we enjoy seeing what God does when we're generous. This is an invitation that I'm giving to you that has changed my life. And I want that same joy for you. But first, we give ourselves to God. First, we give ourselves to God. You see, this is not about some type of works righteousness. Generosity is about a relationship. And that's what Paul saw of the church in Macedonia. That's what their example was. In verse 5 of chapter 8, he commented on it. He said, "But they, the churches of Macedonia, gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God, to us." That's beautiful, isn't it? That's exactly what it's supposed to be. God has given himself to us in Jesus Christ. And in response, we give ourselves to him. That is the foundation of our relationship with him. It is the starting point of generosity. After we give ourselves to God, then generosity overflows. God gives good things to us, and we keep those good things moving. We do it in obedience, yes, because God told us to do it. That's why we do it. We give it as an act of discipleship because when we do, God is shaping us to be more like Jesus. But we really do it because it's an act of worship. By our generosity, we say to God, "Thank you. I trust you. I love you." May generosity overflow from us.